Today's episode is powered by Lightyear, the award-winning platform backed by Richard Branson, bringing simple, powerful investing to web and mobile. Welcome to Many Happy Returns, where we aim to make you a better investor. The UK tax year is about to end, and most people know about ISAs and pensions. But how much could you really invest tax-free if you made full use of every allowance?
From junior ISAs and SIPs to dividend and capital gains tax allowances, we crunch the numbers to find out how much a typical family can shield from the taxman. And in today's dumb question of the week, what would the ISA allowance be today if it had kept pace with inflation? All right, let's get into it. So the end of the tax year is rapidly approaching. Now, I'm sure everyone who listens to this is prepared way ahead of time and isn't panic rushing to fill all their allowances right before the end of the year. Roman, are you well prepared this year?
I'm rushing to fill my allowance for this tax year.
You left it till the last minute.
Yeah, well, I didn't have enough money, to be fair. So, I don't pay myself much, so...
Well, you better get a move on. And I thought a timely episode would be if we look through all the different allowances in the UK tax system around ISAs, pensions, and all the rest of it, and then add them all up and see, well, what could you realistically invest without having to pay tax, or at least not right now? And I thought we'd do this for the typical family. What's the typical family? Well, I've got 2 kids, you got 2 kids. Let's say we're normal. So 2 adults, 2 kids. Where should we start? Should we start with ISAs?
Yeah, that's a good place to start because they're a very vanilla product. Almost everyone uses an ISA, I'd say.
And they're pretty generous. So for an adult, you can put £20,000 per year into your ISA.
And the important thing to understand about ISAs, the most wonderful thing, is you never pay capital gains or income tax on the investments inside the ISA. So if you do accrue a large value over a long period of time, that can be incredibly valuable and it can represent a huge tax saving.
And some people do accrue a huge amount of value in their ISA over time.
So we've got over 4,000 ISA millionaires in the UK. The thing to remember is that most of those, the average age of those people is in their 70s. So these are probably people that invested in PEPs, TESAs, which you could then roll over into ISAs. So they were probably saving for over 30 years, which means that the returns they had to generate to get to $1 million probably wasn't huge. Just a regular investment in an index fund would probably have got there.
If you'd started right at the beginning and maxed out your ISA every year. Because the key thing is the allowance doesn't roll over.
But I know that some of those people are much younger, so a combination of leverage and luck might have got you there as well.
And I think the ISA product is quite unique to the UK. A lot of countries don't have this, and you're going to be paying capital gains tax and income tax on dividends on all your investments. So we should really cherish it. There are some countries that have kind of equivalent products. So in the US, they have a Roth IRA, don't they? And I was reading that you were talking about people who have got a large amount of wealth tucked up in ISAs. You say they're ISA millionaires. There are some people in the US who have built these Roth IRAs up to quite staggering levels. So Peter Thiel, the famous tech investor, over the last 20 years, he has accrued $5 billion in his Roth IRA. Tax-free. And to just clarify with Peter Thiel, he wasn't doing that with index funds, obviously. What he managed to do was invest pre-IPO in some really lucrative stocks like PayPal and Facebook, and then shovel those stocks very early on into his Roth IRA, which then ballooned to this crazy level. You can't really do that in the UK, actually. So it's hard to get much beyond $1 million up to this point. You'd have to do it through public markets largely.
Yeah, so impossible to do a similar thing in the UK. I don't think you could reach $1 billion in a reasonable period of time, but they are incredibly valuable, $20,000 a year per person. So if you're a couple, $40K, and of course the cumulative effects of that tax-free investment compounding over time could be immensely valuable later on in life.
So let's tally this up as we go then. For our family of 4, we've got 2 adults. They can each put $20,000 in their ISA. That's £40,000 of allowances, tax-free per year. But we've also got 2 kids, and they can have junior ISAs, can't they?
That's right. So you can have $9,000 a year per child in junior ISAs. For most people, I think that's a kind of nice way to save for their kids because they'll find that money in their account. You'll be telling them about it and they can blow it on whatever they want. And also it's at a point in life when they probably want the money when you're leaving home, maybe starting your first job, maybe going to uni. So a little bit of cash to help you in that initial stage is very helpful.
And I'm sure at 18, when they get their hands on the money, they'll spend it wisely. They'll appreciate the sacrifices we've made throughout their adolescence and childhood, and now will wisely invest that money for their retirement in index funds.
It's so funny talking to people about this because they're split 50-50. Some people say, I would not trust my child with this money. And so they don't do this. They don't have junior ISAs. Or alternatively, they have complete trust in the kid that they're going to do the right thing. Or they say, I don't care. It's up to them, whatever they do with it.
Which approach do you take?
Well, for us, I think we used, in fact, I know we used cash ISAs, so they hugely underperformed over the course of their life. I think I didn't have an active role in choosing what product they went for, but I can't remember what they used it for. I don't know if they've even still got the ISAs, to be honest. It's really up to them. But the important point, I guess, also is that if you're making contributions, it's not just you that can make those contributions. Anyone can. So once you set it up as a parent, then granny can put in, uncle and aunts, or just friends of the family if they want to.
Yep. So pass the begging bowl round and try and get that £9,000 in there per year. So for our family of 4, we've got 40,000 in ISAs and 18,000 now for the 2 kids in junior ISAs.
Can I also say that I think the junior ISA is a good product in terms of investment in the child's knowledge, because you can talk about what it's invested in and why. If they see that it's in one index fund, they might think that's kind of boring, but you can explain how these things work. They can take control of what it's invested in when they're 16, but they can't have the money till they're 18. But as a way of teaching the kids about saving, investment, and the benefits of it, I think it's an incredibly valuable product.
I think that's the way to do it, to use it as a learning tool. So I know that some people put this money into the junior ISA all along, and they don't really tell the kid about it because they're afraid the kid will think, oh, that money's just coming to me when I'm 18. Why am I going to do my paper round? And it might change their way of thinking about money. But I think that's the wrong approach. I think you've got to involve them along the way. Otherwise, they will do something crazy with it at 18.
But $9,000 per year for 18 years, that's a pretty chunky lump of cash. Plus, you'll get the compounding from the early investments. And of course, because it's an investment over a long period of time, putting a lot of it into equity probably makes sense. So the single index equity fund approach probably works very well for that.
It's interesting, isn't it? It depends what they're going to do with the money and when. If they want that money to fund their time at university, let's say when they're 18, that's almost like a retirement, right? You're going to have a call on capital at that point, and you presumably want to de-risk in the 5 years before that, when they're 13 or whatever.
Yeah, they have sequencing risk. So another great way of learning about that kind of potential for a loss if you have to draw on the money at a particular point in time.
But then again, maybe they are using it for their retirement savings and they will just want it in equity the whole time.
Which makes the compounding even more powerful. Because if you've been investing since they were 0, they've already got about 18 years of compounding for the early investments. So they'll see the huge benefits of that.
Don't you think you should be able to say, I'm planning to have kids in 10 years' time, therefore I can have a kind of prenatal junior ISA, get the money squirreled away early.
So instead of a gleam in father's eye, it's a gleam in the taxman's eye.
Well, no, I don't think they'll be happy about it.
No. And that brings us on to another really useful allowance, which is the SIP, the self-invested personal pension. And what I like about this product is that it really does focus on the long term, because you can only withdraw the money when you're age 57 from 6th of April 2028, 55 before that. So if you are investing at the age of 20, say, you have to have that long-term mindset, which is always valuable for an investor.
And here the annual allowance varies depending on your income level, but the maximum it could be per year is £60,000. And you're able to roll over unused allowances from the last 3 tax years.
Unlike ISAs, where if you don't use that year's allowance, you lose it.
So potentially there's a lot of money you can put in a pension in a year. But to be clear, this isn't tax you'll never pay. It's deferring tax to the point of withdrawal from the pension.
Now, the assumption here is that you pay a lower rate of tax in retirement when you're drawing on the capital than you did when you were putting the capital in, because that's the tax benefit.
Yep. And that you will be able to withdraw 25% tax-free. Let's hope that's still there when we reach 57 or 68 or whatever it is by the time we get there.
The rules do seem to keep changing very frequently.
Oh, yeah. Because a lot of people were using their pensions, their SIPs, as an estate planning vehicle, really. because there were some nuances in the rules of inheritance tax, which meant that pensions sat outside the estate and could be passed on without incurring inheritance tax. A lot of people were putting money in just with the idea that it would go to their children when they died. The government has obviously said the rules are changing around that in the next few years, and you will be paying inheritance tax on it. So people, I think, have started to spend down their pensions quite rapidly. I've been reading pieces in the financial press over the last week about how a lot of people are taking their families on very nice holidays to the Caribbean and what have you.
So cruise companies must have really benefited from that tax change.
Is that the right approach, do you think?
I think it is now, because if you're not worried about leaving money for your kids, then why not spend it? Plus, I think it's good in a way because you can spend that money while you're still around and you're not so focused on kind of post-mortem gifts. I think maybe it's better to have those nice experiences with your family while you're still alive and to spend on both of you, you and them, and experiences.
Yeah, no, I agree. But there were people who were saving and investing with the intention of passing on a rather large nest egg, and their plans got upended because they were using pensions, which really are intended to fund your retirement. But there was a quirk in the law which meant they were great for inheritance tax planning. They were using those in a way that wasn't really intended, but just sort of happened to be in the law. And now the law's changed and they're upset about it.
Understandably, I think. There is a lot of anger. But it was a temporary reprieve. Before 2015, that loophole didn't exist.
Yeah, I just think people look at it and say, oh, I don't know, I've got £1 million in my pension. That was going to go to my heirs. They could just do what they want with it. But now I've got to pay potentially 40% inheritance tax on it. And then when they withdraw the money, they've got to pay maybe another 40% income tax on it. That £1 million ends up as, like 300-400 grand when they actually get their hands on it.
Yeah, it is now just a personal pension. It is about you, not about your kids. And spending it, yeah, absolutely, it makes sense. That's its purpose.
And we should be clear that there is an inheritance tax allowance, which for a couple who've got a house and all of that is like £1 million. But I'm assuming there that the house has used up most of that allowance and this pension is all going to be subject to inheritance tax. But yeah, spend it. Why not?
But there is a very generous way of passing money to your kids without paying inheritance tax, and that's to pay into a junior SIP. Now, not everybody wants this. I always compare it to cathedral building because I grew up in Worcester where there's this massive cathedral, and it was just a beautiful, beautiful building, which I absolutely adored. But of course, the people who built it probably didn't live to see its completion in the Middle Ages. Similarly, with a SIP, a junior SIP, you won't live probably to see your kids get that money. It's just going to be a nice thing which they've got as a retirement nest egg.
Isn't there a Greek proverb which says, a society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in?
Oh, that's lovely. So let's just go through some of the numbers and how this works. You get up to £2,880 you can put in for each of your children's junior SIPs every year. Now, the taxman assumes that they're basic rate taxpayers, which is kind of weird. But if that's the case, then they get grossed up to £3,600 by the government per year. The control of the junior SIP passes to your child at the age of 18. And of course, they can't make those withdrawals until the age of 57 currently. So the question is, how valuable will that be over the course of their lifetime? So if you do some basic sums, if you put in the full allowance for 15 years, leave it for 50 years, which is when they'll retire, then that'll reach £1 million in today's money. And that's assuming a real return of 5.2% for the investment which you've got, which an equity investment would probably achieve. So really imagine this child goes through life, you've maxed out their allowance for 15 years, and it's not a huge investment from your point of view, unless you've got lots of kids.
Or not much money.
But if you do that, they'll go through their entire life thinking, well, my pension's maxed out, I'm going to be a millionaire, I really don't have to worry about retirement. That takes some of the pressure off if they have to think about what they're going to do for their life, because it's not about saving for their pension. They know they'll be okay once they retire. Maybe that'll be a less stressful life. Maybe it'll make them lazy. Some people don't like that junior SIP for that very reason. It takes away some of the reasons to struggle through life and have accomplishments which generate money.
Yeah, I do see that. I've got young kids myself, and it's a hard thing to weigh up, the balance between those two things. The ideal would be for the money to be there for them, but them not to really know about it, or at least not know how much it is until they're much older. But you can't really do that.
Again, I think it comes down to how you feel about your kids and whether you think they should put aside money for themselves and their character. Do you think they're the kind of person who'd perhaps focus on making the world a better place? Maybe they'd work for a charity and not require such a high income as a result of having this junior SIPP.
I don't know. Maybe I'm a bit of a pessimist, but I tend to think that when my kids reach the age where they're going to be working, who knows what the world of work is going to look like? You see how fast artificial intelligence is progressing now. Now, obviously, throughout history, people have been like, oh, everyone's going to be unemployed. The robots are going to take all our jobs or whatever. But maybe the robots will take all our jobs this time. I don't know. I would rather them have a bit of a cushion there in case we have that kind of future.
But if we did have that future, I guess the point is that maybe we wouldn't have to work so hard. The robots would do the work and you wouldn't need such a large income. If your robot's tending to your vegetable garden, you may not need so much money to live.
True, but I'd rather buy them shares in the robot manufacturers now so they can benefit from the sweet, sweet capitalism along the way.
Well, you could do that with a junior SIPP, I guess, and then you double up.
Yeah. No, hopefully the index fund will capture that if that's the way the world goes. But anyway, let's add up where we've got to so far. So we've got 2 adult ISAs for a total of £40,000. We've got 2 junior ISAs for a further £18,000. We've got 2 pension allowances for £120,000 and 2 junior pension allowances for £7,200, which takes us to £185,200.
Michael, this is starting to sound like a game show.
This is not a game, Roman. This is life.
Today's episode is sponsored by Lightyear, the award-winning investment platform created by previous team members at Wise and backed by Richard Branson, designed with simplicity and transparency in mind. Available both on the web and mobile, Lightyear is transforming the way you invest. For those looking to grow their wealth, Lightyear offers a fantastic stocks and shares ISA that comes with 0 custody fees, no subscription fees, and ETFs free of order fees. While fund manager fees apply and a potential FX fee of 0.35% may be charged on currency conversions, you can execute stock orders for a maximum of just £1 per trade. It's a straightforward, cost-effective way to invest without unnecessary charges eating into your returns. If you're a business owner, Lightyear has tailored solutions for you too. Their business account comes with no custody, subscription, or account fees. You'll get access to a multi-currency account, enjoy the same execution-free ETFs, and a maximum of £1 per stock order. Additionally, you can invest your cash in money market funds to earn interest that tracks the central bank policy rate, all while keeping your books tidy with downloadable accounting reports. Keep in mind that money market funds, like all investments, carry risks. As a special offer for our listeners, use the promo code PensionCraft or click the link in the description to get $10 worth of a US fractional share of your choice in your general investment account. Remember that investing involves risk, as the value of your investment can go down as well as up.
All right, so we've covered ISAs and pensions, your standard stuff. But there are other allowances in the tax system we should cover. And these are for investments and money you hold outside of ISAs and pensions. Now, here you will have to pay potentially dividend tax, capital gains tax, or income tax if it's interest on cash. But there are allowances here, so you don't start paying tax from the first penny you receive.
And if we're going to do a like-for-like comparison, I think you can do that, but you have to assume a certain rate of return, either for the capital or for the income.
Yeah, so let's try and think how that works. So for an ISA, we know we can just put £20,000 in. That's how much we can add to the account. But let's look at capital gains tax allowance. You have a £3,000 allowance per year per person. But that's nothing to do with how much you can add to anything. That's how much gain you can make on your investments outside an ISA before you start paying capital gains tax. So we kind of need to convert that into how much could we have invested theoretically to use up that capital gains tax allowance of £3,000.
So a reasonable assumption for capital gain might be something fairly conservative, say 5%.
Yep, I'll go with that, 5%. Walk me through the maths, Roman.
Okay, so let's say you've got 60k invested and you're getting 5% growth a year. Well, that's going to be £3,000. And that's the capital gains tax allowance.
Right, I see. So in theory, if it grew by 5% and we harvested that full gain, we would just use up the maximum capital gains tax allowance for the year and not have to pay any tax on that. But I guess it's assuming that 60 grand is invested in an asset which grows by exactly 5% between when you bought and sold the asset, and it doesn't pay any dividends along the way, right? It's pure capital growth.
Which is impossible to manage. So this isn't a very practical approach, but this gives you a rough idea of an equivalent amount invested.
Yeah, it's kind of impossible to manage. But then there are stocks that grow that don't pay dividends, like Berkshire Hathaway's never paid a dividend, for example. But anyway, let's move on to the next allowance. We've got a dividend allowance of £500, so less than the capital gains tax allowance, but still £500. I guess we can work through that in the same backward engineering way to see what we could have invested.
So again, let's assume that the dividend yield, which is the amount it pays out as a percentage of the amount invested, let's assume that dividend yield is again 5%. Well, that converts into 10k invested to generate £500.
Yep, I get it. So that's saying we've chosen a dividend-paying stock, has no capital growth.
Sounds like the UK stock market.
Right, yeah. And it's paying us a 5% yield. So we need 10 grand invested to max out our dividend allowance. Please don't take any of this as financial or tax advice. This is just illustrative numbers.
And these have been changed very radically recently. They've been cut quite dramatically in the case of dividend allowance, for example.
Yeah, and capital gains tax allowance. And there's one final allowance, which I think we should mention, which isn't really around investing, but kind of is, which is the personal savings allowance. Now, this applies when you get interest paid on cash you hold with the bank or wherever. And it does vary, this level of allowance, depending on what band of taxpayer you are. So if you're a basic rate taxpayer, you get £1,000 personal savings allowance. If you're a higher rate taxpayer, you get £500 allowance. And if you're an additional rate taxpayer, someone who makes a lot of money, you get no personal savings allowance.
So let's just assume that the listeners to this podcast are higher rate taxpayers. Then again, if we use this 5% interest rate, which is completely arbitrary, then you could have £10,000 in tax-free savings to use that £500 personal savings allowance.
Yeah, so the math is exactly the same as the dividend allowance there. Okay, right, I think we've got there. I think we've talked through all the allowances that are sort of normal and accessible to most people.
So what are the scores on the doors now, Michael?
Well, let's go through it then. We talked about for ISAs, junior ISAs, pensions and junior pensions, we had 185,200. And then we've just mentioned here, we've got capital gains tax allowances, dividend allowances and personal savings allowances. So if you add those three things up for two adults, you've got £8,000 of allowances, which from the maths we just did equates to around £160,000 of investments and cash in assets. So add all of that up, we've got 193,200 of allowances, which using our indicative back of the fag packet maths converts into around 345,200 of assets.
That's a lot.
Now, some of that is what you can add every year with like ISAs and pensions, and some of that is just the total you can have, which is the case around capital gains and dividend allowances. But it is a lot, isn't it? It seems like a lot. I was surprised how high it was when I started adding all this stuff up.
Yeah, I was really shocked when we first came up with the numbers. But remember that the pension, all you're really doing is deferring the tax to be paid when you draw it as a pension in retirement.
And as you said, the pension savings probably to your advantage because you're likely to be paying a lower marginal tax rate as a retiree than when you're working, but it's not guaranteed. All of these things are going to depend on your personal circumstances and your financial plan. But still, there's a huge amount of money you can sock away in tax advantage accounts and through these allowances. But what if you're not happy with that, Roman? Is there some way that if we blow through all of these allowances, we can still best the taxman?
Well, I'm happy you asked, Michael, because there are other ways, slightly more esoteric ways, ones that perhaps people aren't aware of. If they're regular listeners, they'll be aware of the trick with Gilts. Now, if you lend money to the government effectively by buying UK government bonds, as a UK investor, you don't pay capital gains tax on those gilts. Same's true for corporate bonds in the UK. So if you buy gilts which have a low coupon, remember the total return on a bond is capital gain plus the coupon you pay, and the two add up to the total yield, which currently is around 4.5% as we record this, depending on the maturity. Well, if the coupon's low, the capital gain's high, and that means the tax you pay is low. So loads of people, if they've got a large sum of money which they want to park in a safe investment, which has got a reasonable real return currently, they've been plonking it into these low coupon gilts.
Yeah, it does make a lot of sense if you've gone through your ISA allowance. I see that on the PensionCraft website for members, you have a tool which kind of converts the yield to maturity on a gilt into what you would have to earn from a savings account to match it, because obviously you're going to pay tax on those savings, whereas you pay some tax, you pay tax on the coupon, but you don't pay tax on the capital gain with a gilt. So it's a bit of a complex calculation to work out what the equivalent interest rate would be when you take account of tax.
And it depends on which tax band you're in. So if you're an additional rate taxpayer, the benefit is huge. And you have to have a huge return on your bank deposit in order to match a given gilt, particularly the low coupon ones.
Should we give an example of that? Can you dig one out for us?
So here's a personal favourite, TN28. That's the identifier for the bond. So this is a gilt which is going to mature on January the 31st, 2028. The coupon, which is the regular semi-annual payment it makes, is 0.1%. So an absolutely tiny, tiny coupon. But the total yield for the bond, the yield to maturity, is just under 4%.
Yeah, I think that's what confuses some people when they've not done this before. They look at it and go, this bond is paying me just a tiny, tiny bit of interest. Pah, rubbish. But that's not what you should be looking at.
Now, the price of the bond, the price that you'd pay as we record this, would be just under £90. So you've got £10 of capital gain, so 10% capital gain. Now, if you annualise that, that turns into 3.8% per year capital gain yield. The income yield's only 0.15, so they add up to the total yield, roughly.
And the trick is that we're not paying capital gains tax, right?
Yeah. Now, you do pay tax on the income that you get from the gilt. And, of course, it's got that allowance that you talked about, which is the personal savings allowance.
Let's assume we're not going to use the personal savings allowance. Let's assume we've used that anyway. What's the scores on the doors? What's the equivalent interest rate we'd need from your bog standard savings account in a bank to match the yield we've got on this gilt?
So the gross equivalent yield, which is what that is 6.5%, an absolutely huge return. And I'm not sure many bank deposits are going to generate that right now.
That's the power of tax, though, isn't it? You really have to think about tax with your investing, especially when it comes to these safe investments, because that is what is going to determine which investment is more attractive often.
So that's assuming a 40% rate of tax, which is the kind of middle band in the UK. For the basic rate taxpayers, the deposit would have to generate 4.9%. And if you're an additional rate taxpayer, it would have to generate 7% per year to compete with this gilt.
And that's why gilts have become extraordinarily popular, haven't they, in recent years?
Yeah, it's one of the most popular investments on the platforms that offer them, in fact, which is pretty remarkable. I knew they'd come back into fashion.
Talking to you, Roman, made me invest in some individual gilts and my wife. So there's a win there.
My job is
Never
done.
thought I'd see the day. Yeah.
Yes.
And it was surprisingly easy. Like, it's not difficult to buy them at all.
Well, they trade just like stocks on the London Stock Exchange. You
Yeah.
know, there's a price you pay. That's it.
If you could get commission from the UK government on their gilt sales of everyone you've talked into buying a gilt, you'd be quids in.
That's true.
All right, have we covered anything? Or is there anything else you want to touch on when it comes to tax advantaged investing in the UK?
This is turning into one of those ads again, isn't it? But wait, there's more. So we've got three other things, right? We've got venture capital trusts, enterprise investment scheme, and seed enterprise investment scheme. So let's start with VCTs. Now, the idea with a venture capital trust is that the government wants to encourage investors in the UK to provide capital with early stage UK companies, because that's good for growth, it's good for tax revenue in the future, and that's good for investors now because there's this tax benefit, which is that if you invest in these venture capital trusts, which is just an actively managed fund, remember, Now, normally you pay high fees for these, often a fixed annual percentage plus a percentage for the upside, like a hedge fund. If you do that, you get a 30% upfront income tax relief on your investments up to £200,000 per tax year. You also get dividends on these things, tax-free, and often the dividends on these funds are very high, something like 6% or even higher. And then when you sell the fund, if you've held it for more than 5 years, you get capital gains tax exemption on it. So all around, incredible tax benefits if you're willing to do the investment. But
yeah, here's the but, it's risky.
This is not like a gilt. This is early stage companies, all based in the UK, so very much linked to the UK economy. You're paying very high fees on them, and you're assuming that the fund manager is not going to do a bad job. So all round, a very risky investment, which is also true of the EIS and the SEIS, where you're doing something similar and getting similar benefits, but for a single company. So for the EIS, you get 30% income tax relief on investments up to £1 million. You get the capital gains tax deferral on that, and there's tax-free growth if you hold it for at least 3 years. So I often speak to people where they say, oh yeah, I've got a mate, he's got a tech company, I invested in it with an EIS scheme. And if it's an even earlier stage company, you call that SEIS, which is the Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme. So there are many, many generous schemes which you've got in the UK, but I think these last three are not for everyone. I've never invested in a VCT, for example. I've thought about it, but I've never actually done it. Many of our members have, it has to be said, and they were quite happy with it, mostly to do with the dividends.
Yeah, it's not something I've invested in either. Who knows though, maybe one day. But before we wrap up, I just want to say that I don't see tax as evil. Like, we've done this whole episode around avoiding tax legally, like using the schemes that the government has put there to incentivize certain behaviors. But I don't think we should begrudge paying our tax. I don't want to end this capitalist episode on a lefty liberal point, Robin.
I've got to say I feel the same way. You know, beyond a certain point, these are very generous limits. And I think paying some tax in order to be a little bit more redistributive, I think that's a positive for society, because I think it's always good to give other people a leg up if they haven't been so fortunate as we have. And I think I have to admit I have been very fortunate in life. I had very supportive parents and we were quite wealthy, and that allowed me to get a good education and move into investment banking via physics. So that environment, I'm very grateful for it. And I would like to pay a little bit back into society in order to let other people climb up rather than draw up the drawbridge.
Well, you were very fortunate. For me, it was just skill, though, the whole way through. Of course not.
Now, we've mentioned many of the allowances that you've got access to, but it's often quite difficult to work out what precisely the benefits would be. So, for example, we've got our Gilts tool, which shows you how much tax saving you could make on individual Gilts. To learn more about that and how to become a member, just go to our website, pensioncraft.com/membership.
Okay, today's dumb question of the week is, what would the ISA allowance be today if it had kept pace with inflation?
Now, as we record this, the annual ISA allowance is £20,000 a year per person, and that was raised from £15,000 in April 2017. So it's been locked at this £20,000 limit for 8 years.
And not only that, the government has announced that it will stay frozen at £20,000 until 2030, which would mean around a 13-year freeze in the ISA allowance.
But you're probably thinking that can't be good, because in real terms, that's falling due to inflation.
Yeah, the fiscal drag effect, which all governments love. But how big an effect has inflation had then on this allowance?
Now, if it had risen in line with inflation since that freezing point in 2017 up to 2025, the tax-free allowance today would be £26,000, actually £26,082.
And if the freeze does go ahead till 2030, obviously the impact will be even greater. However, Romin, I've seen everyone quote this and saying, oh, woe is me, the ISA allowance is frozen and I've missed out on £6,000 each year that I could have been putting into my ISA. But, they're taking it from the peak, right? It wasn't always 20,000. When ISAs were originally introduced back in 1999, the annual allowance was £7,000. What happens if we inflation adjust that today from 1999?
If we inflation adjust, it would be just £13,000.
Which is less than our £20,000. So when people say the ISA hasn't kept up with inflation, well, yeah, it depends when you're counting from, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think however you look at it, it is a very generous allowance. And most people probably can't afford the 20,000 contribution every year.
No, definitely. Most people can't afford it. I think of the people who have ISAs, only around 17% use their full allowance in a year.
So this will benefit the people who are on higher incomes. So for example, if you have an income of 150k or greater, then 59% of those people will use their full allowance.
So if you are one of those fortunate people able to fully fill up your ISA every year, well done. But also, let's be grateful, right?
Yeah, in fact, I saw a YouTube comment for one of my videos recently where they said the 2 reasons why they love the UK are the ISA and the SIP.
Nothing else.
I gave them a list, actually.
What did you have on there?
I had cream teas, apples, sense of humour, pubs, gardens, brilliant gardens in the UK.
And podcasts.
Indeed.
Thank you for joining us for Many Happy Returns. Keep sending us your questions, no matter how dumb, at mhr@pensioncraft.com.
And do remember to check out PensionCraft.com for all the information about our membership, courses, and investment coaching options.
Many Happy Returns is a PensionCraft production, co-hosted and executive produced by Romin Nakiza and Michael Pugh. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes and is not financial advice. We do not provide recommendations or endorse any decision to buy, sell, or hold any security. We cannot be held responsible for any actions listeners may take, and investors are encouraged to seek independent financial advice.